So the maxim is, diversions occur. They really do, and all you can do is to make them count. And then you can salvage whatever is possible for your main goal. So I want to illustrate that. So here's the first diversion. Gordon Bell came to town, gotten tired of deck, and so he showed up, and he couldn't stand going to MIT. So he showed up here at CMU to be a professor for a while, and so he was writing a book about all his experience in building machines, and he came around and he gave me a chapter, and I read this chapter, and it was so awful you cannot imagine. I don't know how many of you have heard Gordon speak, but Gordon kind of speaks like this all the time, okay? And he writes worse, okay? So he's a new faculty member. He's supposed to be nice to new faculty members. You know, that's kind of the culture. So I started to edit this manuscript for Gordon to help him out. And now Gordon, in fact, will organize anything that moves slower than he is, okay? And so first thing I knew, I was co-opted as a co-author, and there I was with a real diversion on my hand, because this book was out of control from the beginning, okay? And as you can see, this is essentially, what is that, 6 years. 6 years of this effort went on. So you got to make it count. Now what actually happened was that within that, for entirely bookish reasons, because we couldn't stand the plethora of notations from all the different reprints that we were doing, we invented two notations called PMS and ISP. Most of you know what ISP is, Instruction Set Processor Language. That has become, in fact, a fairly standard term. Probably nobody knows what PMS is anymore, standing for Processor Memory Switch Language, a language of computer configurations. But both of these were major scientific contributions. That's what I mean by making it count. As far as salvage was concerned, I took one big thing out of this, 6, 7 years experience. Namely, I understood what architectures were about. I don't think I understood what architecture is about when I went in, and in fact the field didn't either. One of the things that book did was to help pull together a nascent notion within the computer field about architectures and the space of architectures. And that's really one of the main contributions of the book. But I sort of salvaged this little piece from this huge effort. All right. So here's my second diversion, which is Raj Reddy and the speech understanding system. That again goes from 7 years, 1970 to 76. There was a small part of this which was trying to help the DARPA community, which needed to have a head of a little committee to tell it to do speech understanding research when what it knew it wanted to do was speech understanding research. That's the function of committees in our society, is when everyone knows what they want to do, you create a committee to tell you. And since I was innocent of this whole thing, Larry Roberts sort of tapped me. But the real reason, it turns out, was that Raj was here. Raj was one of the people who deeply knew he wanted to work on speech recognition research. So in fact, the diversion was really to help Raj as well. Okay, in fact, I tell you privately now that the whole thing is over, it was more to help Raj than to help the DARPA community. So we ran this speech understanding thing. I ended up being chairman of the steering committee. I ended up writing a goddamn book about the whole thing. On and on it went. It was, in some sense, in its own terms, it was indeed a major success. All I got out of it, that's the salvage part, all I got out of it was at least I understood sensory processing a little bit, which I'd never understood before, and that helps me a little bit in understanding the nature of human cognition and so forth. But again, in terms of the maxim, if you're going to go be diverted, make it count. And we made the speech understanding system count. So let's go on. Lots of diversions. So here's the third diversion. This is Stu Card and Tom Moran and the psychology of HCI. Again, lasted for 11 years, all right? One of the points I will make, I might as well make it now, is these diversions seem to last a long time. And since the point of diversions is don't let them really get in the way, always come back to the main goal, it really pays to have a long life, okay? So the diversion was Newell, my wife, and I are both creatures of San Francisco, both born and raised in San Francisco, so we're West Coasters, and worse than that, okay? San Francisco at that time was a very attractive place, and Pittsburgh was not so attractive as it is now. So there sort of was a need to get something on the West Coast that would help us sort of go back there all the time. So that was the diversion. And so we generated, when Xerox PARC came into existence in 1971, we generated a consultantship out there, and we invented the notion that maybe it was time to apply all that we understood about cognition to some area, like how humans interacted with computers, or how they did programming, or something like that. And then I convinced two of my graduate students, Stu Card and Tom Moran here, that what they wanted most in the world was to go out and join me at Xerox PARC. Well, I stayed here and just consulted out there first. And we would create this little unit to go build this thing. All right, so that's all diversion. Now, it turns out that on the uses side, we sort of developed strongly and early, 1975, 76, the notion of routine cognitive skills. We devoted a class of models called GOMS for characterizing when humans are operating in a routine fashion in a cognitive skill. We helped establish, there wasn't enough room over here to say it, but we actually helped establish the whole field of HCI as an endeavor. In fact, the title of our book, which is called Human-Computer Interaction, is sort of the first major use of that term as far as I'm aware. So, you know, there we are again. If you're going to be diverted, at least make good use of it. Now, what did I salvage? I actually salvaged quite a bit from this effort. Bonnie won't probably like my talking about it as salvage, but that's all right. A piece of this, a kind of a little add-on piece of this, was the developing of something called the model human processor, which is an attempt to kind of characterize, from what psychology knew, cognitive psychology, all the activities that occurred in the human as they were interacting with the machine. And that gave me a view of what it would be to have a unified theory of cognition. Okay, so I had a real activity, a presaging activity, that set me up for understanding that when I came back to that a number of years later. So I actually salvaged a lot out of that one. Well, there's at least one more diversion. This is Zog. Don McCracken and George Robertson in a system called Zog. The diversion is, again, two great graduate students in a system which nobody has heard about called LSAR. We won't come to LSAR very much, but I'll touch on it. In which, for a number of odd reasons, but mostly because George and Don were real excited, we set out to produce what you would now call a hypermedia system. Now, we didn't invent hypermedia systems, and in fact, there was another system around called the Promise system, which had a network of 30,000 frames, okay? And we essentially said, that's important from a computer science point of view. Let us create a these guys are a bunch of medical characters. Let us create a version like that in the computer science world. And in fact, we actually helped them push the whole notion of hypermedia around. We attempted a major application. We did it. It's a little unclear for reasons I won't go into here whether it was a success or not. This was, in fact, putting a whole Zog system, which is this big hypertext network, putting a whole Zog system on the Carl Vincent carrier to help manage that carrier's operation. Again, in some sense, if you're going to go be diverted, get some use out of it. Get some general use out of it. What was there to salvage? Turns out there was only one thing to salvage that I could see. The one thing that happened in our getting into that was that a lot of people, 2, 3, something like that, a lot of people were really convinced that this network of 30,000, which they soon envisioned being 300,000 and so on, was essentially an artificial intelligence. Now, they were wrong. They were absolutely wrong. But that was, you know, when Bruce Waxman, one of the characters like this, who knew about this system, which was out of the computer science world, so it was way over on the side in the medical world, came to me, he said, that's where artificial intelligence really is. You ought to go understand it. Okay, what I learned out of this is there are no shortcuts to intelligence. Hypermedia has nothing to do with intelligence. it's not the nature of how humans think.